Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Sunday School Dropouts podcast. We are so excited to have you here with us today.
Yes, we are. I'm super excited. As everybody knows, season 2, we've been focusing a lot on the medical and financial impacts of religious trauma and high control religion. And I'm so thrilled today to be able to have our guest who's, we'll tell you a little bit more about him in a moment, but we're going to be talking to Dr. Eric Sprankle, who is a clinical psychologist, but also teaches human sexuality and sexual health on a college level. And I just am excited for people to hear our conversation today.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to this one. I think I've followed Dr. Sprankle for a number of years on social media.
Yeah.
Really value his insight and his research, and he's also written a book recently, which we'll also tell you
Mm.
about.
Yeah.
So yeah, really
Yeah.
excited for this one.
Yeah. And I think it's going to be so good because, when we're talking about the medical, we're talking about medical, impacts or whatever. And I think we would be doing a disservice if we didn't touch on like how purity culture played into that and sexual health, like the lack of sexual education and how that can stunt our sexual development. And it just felt really appropriate to have him here. And just the fact that he is, he'll talk about this in the episode, but the fact that he didn't grow up in it and has just like kind of a different approach because he not only because he didn't grow up in it, but because he works with people. He has worked with people who have grown up inside the system, and he's in a space on social media where he's coming in contact with so many people who've grown up in purity culture. It just lends to a really, really good discussion. So I think people will be hopefully they'll be learning a lot and enjoying it and buying his book.
Yeah, oh yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely, absolutely.
Awesome. Right. So before we get into the episode or our conversation with Dr. Sprankle, we'll just remind you that we do know that some of the things that we talk about on here might feel a little bit intense or triggering and can bring things up. Maybe that means you need to process more, or maybe even could be too much to handle right now. So please always feel free to skip any episode or parts of episodes and come back if and when you are ready, because our goal is to help you trust your own body and lived experience so you can take what you need and leave what you don't. Okay, Andrew, I think it is time to do a listener Q&A, and I'm excited for this one. So, are you ready? I feel like we need a drum roll or something, like ready for this question. Here we go.
I am ready.
Mhm. Awesome. What is the difference between a cult and a high control religion? I just recently had somebody email me about this.
Oh, really?
And yeah, so I'm curious to
Oh,
hear
that's
what
cool.
you think. What is the difference? Is there a difference? Are they just the
Yeah.
same thing?
So there's a lot of overlap. I'm trying to. I do have a distinct difference. I'm trying to think how to best articulate this. I think this would be accurate to say that all cults are high control, but not all high control groups are necessarily cults. And
Interesting.
this is my definitions. Feel free to disagree with me, but the reasoning for that is cults typically have an all powerful leader that is present somehow, some way. There's like usually some kind of a personality that is like the figurehead of that group, whereas a high control religion may have that, but not
Mhm.
necessarily. Um,
Interesting. Yeah.
and so I can think like historically, like things that
Mhm.
folks would think of as cults. So like, for example, Mormonism, Joseph Smith, Adventism,
Right.
Ellen White. Those are like obvious and examples, but there's still like groups today that are like, whether religious or even some of these more like kind of some of the wellness,
Yeah.
spiritualized wellness type, like Teal Swan, quite frankly, like
Mm,
her type of stuff. Like that's very culty. That's very culty. And
yeah.
she is this like almost like this unquestionable leader that wields a lot of influence. And
Yeah.
and so like that's a good example of that's
Hmm.
like a cult, for example.
Yeah.
Um,
Interesting.
so anyway, it kind of has to do with like that all powerful figurehead being the different, that
Hmm.
being the main difference. At least that's the way I think of it in my mind. But I'm curious what your take is
Yeah.
on that.
I know that there's a lot of research that's coming out now that's kind of redefining what a cult is, what are the tenets of it, because it used to have like pretty rigid definition, not rigid as in like controlling, but rigid as in like pretty well defined. Like here's kind of the tenets of a cult. And I know that some of the big cult researchers and people that Janja Lalich and Stephen Hassan are kind of starting to look at some of this stuff and going like, do we need to expand what some of those tenets are? And one of those tenets, of course, being the leader piece, of and there's a few other things with like financial stuff and whatnot. And you look at it and you're like, oh yeah, the overlap between high control religion and cults, it's like, almost the same circle, right? When we're looking at
Right.
those, overlapping circles, it's like almost the same thing. Um, and so yeah, I've gotten a lot of people that are like, well, are you just using high control religion instead of the word cult? I'm like, maybe, I don't feel tied to either one of them. But if we are defining, if we're saying like a cult has to be somebody with a defined leader, then yeah, it would be interesting to look and to say, I don't know if they would be the same thing. But then on the other side of it, I'm like, well, is it Jesus, like the leader then of the high control religion? Like, wouldn't that make it a cult? Even though he's dead? Like, I don't know. Like, I mean,
Yeah.
yeah, what do you think?
Yeah. I mean, I'm not really tied to the words. Like, I'm not. It's like, however they're useful. But like, I mean, the way I think, like cult versus high control. Like, I'm thinking of like, evangelical purity culture in the context of the
Yeah,
churches many of us grew up in. Oh, that's high control as hell. But in many
for
cases,
sure.
was there I mean, there might have been a singular leader. There might have been a singular pastor.
Yeah.
In many cases, there wasn't. It was just the prevailing culture that we were within,
Yeah.
that permeated the air we breathed, figuratively and
Yeah.
literally. It's like that there was that, and so that kind of was the high control piece. There maybe wasn't so much a individual that could sort of just wield power and even
Right.
maybe even maybe contradict some of the social norms because they were all
Mhm.
powerful. They could. But there
Mhm.
certainly were some situations where maybe that is what was happening. And so,
Yeah.
however you want to define that, like I do see that as being
Mhm.
a little different when you're in a culture where it's like,
Yeah.
yeah, there's the culture, but you also maybe have a little bit more mobility and agency to do your own thing a little bit. Maybe you can leave or go to a different part of the group. Whereas when there's that all powerful leader, it's like maybe you can't. And maybe
Yeah.
I don't know. And so however one wants to define that, I don't know. But I definitely see
Yeah.
kind of tiers to this
Yeah.
experience where I've seen folks who they've experienced like that all powerful leader situation, and
Mhm.
oof, it's a
Yeah.
very different ball game when you're like in a small high control group and there's this all powerful leader that just has unchecked influence and power over the members
Mhm.
versus rather just
Mhm.
the prevailing culture is high control, is very restrictive, is shame based,
Yeah.
but there's maybe not a singular leader that's like wielding influence. I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah, and that could also really, like I'm thinking about how, there's many different like Christian evangelical Christian denominations, right? And within the denominations or maybe the churches in the denomination, there technically then really could be cults because you might have a church that really does that where it's like they have a pastor or some sort of a leader that is unchecked, that is the one driving this movement, that is, you know, doling out consequences or whatever, yes, maybe they're still Southern Baptist or, whatever it is, right? But yeah, technically then would fit under not only the definition of high control religion, but cult if you have that one person or, a group of a few people or whatever that are in that power position. I just was reading a book about somebody who came out of independent fundamentalist Baptist background, and they definitely defined it as a cult because they would say, Jack Hyles, and there's a couple other people that were extremely high up that could not be questioned.
Yeah.
And people just really took their lead and their cues from that person. So I can definitely see how, um, yeah, like how that leader is like a defining factor in cults. And yeah, I
Yeah.
also know like Stephen Hassan has now done a lot of work on like cults of personality, especially when it's coming into like social arenas, political arenas, things like that. Which is maybe where like Teal Swan fits. But
Yeah.
yeah, it is interesting to see it's interesting to see the research expanding and being able to say like, wow, yeah, the dynamics are pretty much the same in both kinds of groups. There might be a couple different factors that are different, but the underlying motivations and dynamics are the same.
Yeah. Yeah, it is really interesting to see that, and I'm happy that the conversation is expanding. I think that's necessary, not
Yeah.
to make it not that I want it to muddy the waters of like, well, what the hell is a cult, but like that
Yeah.
they're just widening their gaze and we're just talking about this because like I'm
Right.
not committed to any one definition. I think there's a lot of high control systems out there that are very harmful with how they exploit
Yeah.
people, and so I'm glad that
Yeah.
we are widening our gaze and doing more research and having more conversations about this.
Right. Right. Did you ever read the book Cultish by Amanda Montell?
Actually, no, I have not.
Yeah. It's good. I really appreciate it because she talks about, cults and different things like that. Of course, she talks a lot about religion and high control religion, but she talks about some of those like defining features of cults. And it is things like having a language that kind of everybody on the inside knows, but doesn't necessarily translate to the outside, and, how you're spending your time and money and energy and resources and how you're living your life and everything like that. I remember when she talked about the language thing, I was like, "Oh yeah, that is totally a thing." We call it like Christianese or whatever. But you think about that with other groups too, like CrossFit or Soul Cycle or, veganism even. Like there can be these terms that you use that on the inside of the group, what all these terms mean, but outsiders would not know. And that does not make it a cult, simply that you're having to put other things on top of it. But when you look at like, oh yeah, there's a special language that they all have, words that they use, they know what it means when you say the truth or, a believer. Like we don't even have to question what that means. We know exactly what that means. But somebody on the outside be like, believer of what? Or what truth? Like it's interesting to think about some of those things.
Makes me think of Adventism.
Yeah,
It's a
for sure.
very unique culture. Well, just the fact that the morning greeting at church is Happy
Yeah.
Sabbath. Not that there's any that's no mystery what that
Hmm.
means, but just things that are
Right.
so culturally unique that I took for granted until I wasn't in that world
Yeah.
anymore. I'm like, oh wow, nobody else
Yeah.
does that, and it's actually kind of weird. Now that I think about it.
Yeah. Exactly. So it sounds like what we're saying, what is the difference between a cult and a high control religion? They're pretty much the same. We might have a couple things that are standing out, things like, one specific leader or a group of people that are at the top. But underlying and kind of the different dynamics, it's pretty much the same and almost could be interchangeable in a lot of cases.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, yeah, like I said, I've heard people say that the difference with a cult is that one leader, but for all intents
Yeah.
and purposes, I think there's a lot of overlap. What you said about the Venn diagram pretty much being a
Yeah.
circle, a perfect circle.
Yeah.
I don't think that would be inaccurate to say that, quite honestly.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Well, it's a good question, and I'm glad that we're talking about it. So,
yeah, absolutely. Me too. Dr. Eric Sprankle is a professor of clinical psychology and the co-director of the Sexuality Studies program at Minnesota State University, Mankato. He received his doctorate in clinical psychology from Xavier University in 2009 and completed a postdoctoral fellowship at the University of Minnesota Medical School's Institute for Sexual and Gender Health in 2011.
Dr. Sprankle was awarded tenure in the psychology department at Minnesota State in 2017, and he is the author of the recently published book DIY: The Wonderfully Weird History and Science of Masturbation. Welcome, Dr. Sprankle, to the Sunday School Dropouts podcast.
Dr. Schrenkel, thank you so much for being with us today. I know I've
Yeah,
already said
thanks.
before I followed you for quite some time on Instagram.
Mhm.
Also, I was checking because I was a little embarrassed. There's been a couple interviews we've done in the past where I go and check. I'm like, oh, I'm actually not following our guest already.
Yeah.
I followed you for quite some time, and I actually saw you were
Mhm.
followed me. So
Oh,
I'm
cool.
honored and I appreciate that. I had no idea. So I've not really been active lately, but
Mhm.
all of that all of that said though, I'm just curious a little bit about your background in terms of religion. Did you
Mhm.
grow up in a religion of any sort or a religious context?
I did. I grew up Catholic, and I think a pretty common experience, I think, talking with other Catholics is that it was less about, faith and belief and everything like that. And it was almost like just ingrained in us, like this is part of our identity, like it's an ethnicity or something. It's like, it doesn't matter like what we believe or what we do. It's just like, we're Catholics. And so that was kind of like the messaging. That's kind of how it felt. And even like when I became an atheist, like when I was a teenager, I kind of, the Catholic label kind of stuck with me for a while. I forgot like, oh wait, I need to drop that now. I'm no longer Catholic because being Catholic is a specific type of belief system and everything. And like, I don't have those belief systems anymore. So growing up, it was just kind of behavioral religious kind of upbringing, in the sense that, yeah, we went to mass every Sunday, or like the Saturday afternoon one. I went through all the sacraments that a Catholic kid can go through, of like, First Communion, and I all the way up through confirmation into my early teens. And but the worst experience I had growing up as Catholic was just utter boredom, and that was it. Right? I don't remember, like, a Catholic mass is very structured, right? So you say the same things, you do the same things. So those kinds of things stick. Like, there are some prayers I remember, and I know the kind of, if I went to mass right now, I could probably like go along with what's happening, because I remember it, because it's just repetition. But I don't remember a single homily that the priest ever gave. I had to go to CCD, which, because I went to public school, Catholic kids then have to go to once a week, an hour-long Catholic school. And so that was great, more school on top of school. I don't remember a single lesson in CCD. I just remember just kind of joking around with my friends and trying to get each other to laugh and get in trouble during the class. But yeah, so in hearing about how that's so different than those who grew up in like an evangelical kind of environment, where it is like, your parents are deeply involved in it, your community is deeply involved with it, your friends are all deeply involved with it. So leaving that is like you're leaving like a huge support network, and they can kind of turn your back on you a lot. I never had that growing up Catholic, like especially since I went to public school and everything, that once I became an atheist, my life was identical to when I was a Catholic boy, and I was an altar boy even. So that was the big, I think, difference between my upbringing and the upbringing I hear of a lot of other people, is that it was a very smooth transition from being a Christian to not.
Yeah. I grew up in a very Catholic community, and I was always jealous of the kids that got to leave for CCD, because I was like, come on.
Right.
Now I'm glad, obviously. I'm curious to know about that transition towards atheism, and then even now, kind of considering yourself a Satanist. I'd love to know
Right.
more about that, especially when people, I mean, what we're taught about, the Satanists is
Yeah.
definitely not what is actually accurate. So what is that for you?
What is Satanism to me?
Well,
Or their
that, and
atheism?
also I'm curious to know your transition into atheism. What was
Yeah,
that
yeah.
like?
So I'll
And then
start with
move
that.
into Satanism.
Yeah, I don't remember. There wasn't ever like just a single moment where I was like, oh, yeah, now this all makes sense. I'm an atheist now. So I think because of the lack of faith even within Catholicism and just kind of going through the motions, it was just kind of a natural progression of just growing up, getting greater critical thinking skills, and just kind of having greater insight and reflection into like, wait, what are we doing on Sunday mornings? Why are we doing this? And just kind of questioning a little bit more and kind of looking at what the actual faith is about. And I was like, oh yeah, this isn't for me at all. Like, this isn't how I view the world. And so I think it just like slowly shed off of me. If I had any kind of belief, it just kind of like went away in adolescence. And then just kind of adopting that label of atheist, because that was a reflection of like, I didn't believe in God or any kind of higher power. Um, and then just recognizing the potential scarlet letter that comes with that word of labeling yourself an atheist, and kind of seeing how people respond to that. And it's like, oh, this is kind of like a big deal for people. And it never really felt that way. It's just like, I don't believe in God. Like, so what? Um, and then I think around that time too, because, I was a goth teen, I was always into horror movies and heavy metal music, even like pre-adolescent. So that's always been a part of me. And so, of course, in the bookstore in adolescence, I was like looking through the religious section and came across like the Satanic Bible was there, and I was like, "Ooh, I like that." right? Because I was a big fan of like The Omen and The Exorcist and Rosemary's Baby and everything. And I was like, oh, there's a religion devoted to Satan, or at least there's this book called the Satanic Bible. I need to check this out. And so, yeah, I was 16 years old in high school carrying around a copy of the Satanic Bible and reading that. And most of it was kind of like over my head. But there were some things in it that were like, oh, this is pretty cool. This is kind of describing me. And that's the typical experience, I think, with those who are into Satanism, is that once you kind of read about it, it's like this aha moment of like, oh, that's describing me. And I think that's a lot different than the religions that we grow up in within Christianity in particular. It's like, it doesn't really fit who we are. We have to work really hard in order to be the good Catholic, to be the good Christian. It feels very inauthentic. It's a challenge. Whereas Satanism, and what they put forth, is just like, it's be yourself. And it's recognizing the humanity within being human. And essentially looking at those 7 deadly sins of like, yeah, this is natural feelings and emotions and behaviors. And why are we pathologizing them and labeling them a sin? We should be embracing them because this is who we are as people. We're no different than any other animal. And so that's what Satanism is really about. And it's an atheistic belief system. So they don't actually believe in gods and the devils and anything like that. Satan is just a metaphor. It's a symbol to kind of appreciate human desire and drive in our natural state. And so it just fits. I'm a little pretentious when I come to that label because I could take or leave the label of Satanist, but it by default, it kind of fits me. Right, the description of a Satanist is like, yeah, that's describing me. And I think it's hard not to describe an atheist who's also heavily into heavy metal music and horror movies. They kind of fit nicely together. But
I love that.
Yeah, I appreciate the explanation, though. I just know there's, well, myself included, up until just a few very short years ago, like, they're not even realizing that folks who consider themselves Satanists do not believe in a literal Satan. Like, that's not even part of it.
Right.
And most, well, evangelicals anyway, do not know that. You know, that a lot of folks are very, very hyper vigilant about anything that looks like, you know, spiritual warfare or looks demonic or whatever.
Right.
You know?
Right. And there is an effort among a lot of Satanists to do kind of like PR on behalf of the religious aspects of Satanism and to clarify that. And they always make it clear of like, no, Satanists do not actually believe in the devil. They are atheists, and we're not sacrificing babies or like animals or anything like that. Anything that, you know, is in a horror movie about a Satanist, that's just fiction. That's not true. But I'm more of the opposite belief of like, that's part of the fun of it for me, is to weaponize it and to stoke that fear of that fiction, that folklore of what people think devil worship actually is and Satanism actually is. And so, because it's all made up. Right? It doesn't actually exist in that way at all. So, you know, I have satanic tattoos that are visible if I'm wearing short sleeves. And for people to see that and to think like, oh, he must, you know, he's worshiping the devil. Is he sacrificing? Is he dangerous? Like, fine, believe what you want. That's part of the fun of it. If you playing off of people's ignorance is fun to me.
Yeah. That we definitely have something very much in common. Because like I don't even have the tattoos that are, I mean, I have tattoos, but not that are satanic or anything.
Yeah.
But I did something as simple as like one time on Instagram, I made it that the count of people that I was following was 666, and well, you probably wouldn't be surprised at how much like hate mail I got just because of that, and people sharing screen grabs of that and tagging me in it. You're like, because especially being I'm part of the faith deconstruction community, so
sure,
there you go. See, he's a devil worshiper, and just
right, It was
a whole
plays
thing
into
for a
people's
while.
stereotypes, and that's fun. It's like I'm fine with that label. It's not like I'm trying to pretend to be something that I would really object to being labeled as. So yeah, people playing with people's fear of the devil is part of the fun of Satanism, at least for me. Other people don't see it that way, but
No, fair enough.
yeah.
You're a clinical psychologist now. You're a professor. You work with like sexuality, sexual health. That's your specialty. I am so curious to hear how that became your specialty. What got you into all things sex and masturbation and all of that?
Yeah, the specialty came out of my human sexuality class that I took sophomore year in college. So I was a psych major, but I was actually more interested in forensic psych. So I was always interested in, you know, serial killers, and like in high school, I wanted to be like homicide detective and everything. But I switched to psych when I got to college, but still kind of focused on criminal behavior. But After that human sexuality class, and this would have been 2001 at the University of Cincinnati, yeah, that got me hooked into the sexual health field as the subfield within clinical psych, which I even didn't know that existed. And so from that point forward, even second year in undergrad, I was focused on being a clinical psychologist that specialized in sexual dysfunctions and sexual behavior. Now, all through grad school, I was being trained to be a clinician, to work with the population who experiences some type of sexual difficulties. I mean, through postdoc, I went to the University of Minnesota Medical School for a 2-year fellowship in sexual health. And so I did nothing. It was full-time clinical work dealing with some sexual dysfunctions, those who struggled kind of like with their porn use. And I'm sure we'll talk more about kind of what that means a little bit later. But I was getting kind of burned out of clinical work full-time. I had done some teaching as an adjunct when I was in grad school I was an adjunct at Northern Kentucky University, just across the river from where I was going to school. And I really liked teaching. I never got burned out on teaching. And I thought I could really express myself in this field a little bit more than I could with some of the clinical work. But even toward the end of my postdoc, I was still just kind of looking for clinical jobs that were available or trying to create my own within this field. And nothing was really there, but this fixed-term faculty position at Minnesota State University just fell into my lap, and I took that. And that turned in, after 2 years, a fixed-term position. It turned into a tenure track that I got, and I've been there since 2011. And so academia was not on my mind or on my radar to kind of pursue as a career, but I couldn't imagine doing anything else than what I do right now as a professor.
That I love that because I mean, there's so many things that you can do with psychology and, you know, and not just being a therapist. You know, we are in the religious trauma space, you know, post high control religion, all that fun stuff where we have so many of the people that listen to this podcast and that are our clients are coming from backgrounds where, you know, sex is very narrowly defined. It's very rigidly defined. There's heavy consequences for doing anything outside of a very specific way. So like pornography with masturbation, of course, there's a lot of rules around that inside of high control religion. And so I'm just curious to know from your perspective, like, what are some of the things that we get wrong inside of high control religion? You know, that whether it's the inaccurate or harmful messages, practices that you've seen throughout your work.
Yeah, they get everything wrong. I'm not being hyperbolic with that. It's quite a mess. So the interesting thing with quote unquote problems relating to porn or with masturbation, which are common ones that show up in clinical practice, often stemming from religious belief surrounding masturbation and porn. And that's really kind of the focus of it, right? So what gets wrong? What is so wrong about the perspective of those within like kind of the high control religious communities and how they talk about porn and sex and masturbation is that they view it as like porn's the problem, right? It's kind of like this vice that exists out in the secular world that's, you know, and, you know, I've seen some things where it's influenced by the devil. And it's the devil whispering in your ear to make you log on to the computer and look at pornography. And you're inviting demons into your world. I've seen that by masturbating to pornography, you're opening the demonic realm and all these demons can enter your life and attach into you. So it gets very, very bizarre, very, you know, fantastical and even conspiratorial at times. And so they think this world of pornography. And when we talk about pornography, what's interesting is that we're actually talking about masturbation. And that's the part that often gets overlooked. It's easier to talk about porn as kind of like this evil entity because it's a thing, it's material. But people watch porn to masturbate. And so that's actually the underlying discomfort and objection that people have to porn because it's a reflection and a realization of, oh, people have a private, personal, individual solo sexual life. And that is wrong, right? That's wrong because it goes against you know, God's mandate for your genitals and how they should be used only in this one's very narrow and specific way. And so pretty much every sexual behavior goes against that one mandate, but masturbation does deviate from God's plan of your genitals, right? So it's condemned in that way, but it's doubly condemned There's a physician a long time ago, Dr. John Kellogg, who said masturbation is a doubly abominable act. And so it's doubly abominable because it's not only just a sexual sin in and of itself and against your own body, but it's one that we can do anytime that we want, right? We don't need a partner. So it's a sin that's literally at our fingertips and that we can engage in pretty frequently, right? And so with this idea that porn and masturbation are like inherently wrong and bad, what we're looking at is the reality is and this is where it's a self-fulfilling prophecy and very ironic, is that it's actually the attitudes and beliefs that we have about porn and masturbation that predict whether or not it's going to be healthy or unhealthy for us, right? So if we believe that masturbation and porn, masturbating to porn, because that's what we do with masturbation, is a sin, it's immoral, it's unhealthy, it's bad, whatever opposition that we have to it, if we have those beliefs, but then masturbate anyways or watch porn anyways, yeah, there's an incongruence there. And this is known as moral incongruence. And that's going to create a whole host of problems for the person. They're going to feel guilty. They're going to feel ashamed. It's a predictor of labeling oneself a porn addict. And that makes sense because you're doing something that you told yourself you should not be doing. So why else would you be doing this if you weren't a quote unquote addict, right? You feel out of control. So that's what is largely not addressed within the religious messaging of porn and masturbation, is that they're actually creating the problems for themselves by having particular attitudes about porn, about sex, about masturbation, and it's difficult for them to adhere to them. And it's like, where if you had different attitudes about it, if you thought that, yeah, there's nothing inherently wrong with masturbation, it's my own sexuality, my own sexual drive, takes a couple of minutes out of my day, no consequence whatsoever. If you had that belief, yeah, after you masturbate, you're not going to feel distressed. You're going to be able to enjoy the sensation of orgasm and the feelings afterwards. But if you got that little message in your head of like, no, this is bad, I shouldn't be doing this, I'm sinning, and you masturbate, yeah, you're going to feel pretty shitty afterwards, right? And so that's where it's the ironic piece and the self-fulfilling prophecy that you're this is your cross to bear, essentially, of creating these rules, these very rigid rules around sex that are very difficult for most people to adhere to.
Yeah.
Yeah. I have a handful of brothers. So I was very familiar with purity culture of, the quote unquote struggles that all men have and this sexual animal that they are. I know that, porn was always like such a huge part of the conversation. I might be asking the wrong question, because, everybody was labeled a porn addict if they watched even once, right? Yeah. Is there such thing as a porn addiction?
No, not. So I'll preface it with saying, with a rhetorical question of like, can people have problems with how they watch pornography or just the fact that they watch pornography in their life? Absolutely. Right.
Sure.
The reason why they're having problems isn't related to the biochemical mechanisms that are typically attributed to chemical dependency, like an opioid use disorder, right? So watching porn, masturbation does not work in the same way as substance use, right? There's like no tolerance, there's no withdrawal. People try to make like these like anecdotes of like, oh yeah, I watched porn and then it was fine with just like normal vanilla stuff, but I had to keep ratcheting it up to harder and harder core stuff. And that was supposedly proof of like tolerance and everything like that. It's like, no, you were just finding out what actually really turns you on, right? And it kind of looked like, you were kind of getting more extreme, but you were just finding things that were arousing to you that you've never been exposed to before. So in that way, no, porn addiction does not exist. Porn addiction, how we look at it clinically, is kind of what I was saying earlier with this idea of moral incongruence. And that's where someone can feel very out of control because they don't want to be watching pornography. They don't want to be masturbating, but they're doing it anyways. And so for that person, how do they explain that? And they typically start using the addiction language because that's kind of a distancing language, right? And it makes sense. And like spouses of quote unquote sex addicts do that a lot too, of like, oh, he's a sex addict. As a way to kind of like, it's this outside force, right? It's not actually the person. And what's actually going on is just that they've made this vow. Oftentimes it's unspoken in relationships that we shouldn't be watching porn. Other times it's pretty explicit that no, this is off limits. But they get caught, and they do it because it is within their own personal value system. They find it's serving a function in their life in some way. And that's the approach clinically, not from a religious perspective of if you have somebody seeking treatment for a quote unquote porn addiction, I want to know, like, what function does the porn have in their life? What are they getting out of it? Is it just a moment of pleasure, right? Because it's dealing with the desire discrepancy in a relationship, and it's perfectly acceptable and normal for those outside of this religious belief to have a private sexual life in which you can go into your own bedroom or bathroom and masturbate for a couple of minutes, and you feel fine and satiated that drive. And but for others, if you do that, that's essentially viewed as like cheating, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you don't have any kind of right over your own personal solo sexuality. Like there isn't, and there shouldn't be a solo sexuality. Your sexuality is only for partnered sex only. Um, and it's difficult to work with that clinically, right? If somebody still has those strong beliefs, because they are really kind of setting themselves up for a lot of failure and a lot of disappointment and potentially a lot of secrecy and betrayal that comes from the secrecy, right? But the short answer is no, porn addiction does not work in the same way as like a substance use disorder, but certainly people can label themselves as a porn addict because of that discrepancy that they have between their values and their behaviors.
Mm. Such a good way of putting it. Yeah.
I'm curious, what do you see as being some of the long-term impacts of folks who, specifically the folks who do hold to the idea that this is an addiction, this is something I'm struggling with, I shouldn't be doing this, like that whole moral incongruence? Like, what are
Mm-hmm.
some of the long-term impacts, both personally, but like relationally, that you see coming up
Relationally
for
are
folks?
huge ones. I mean, it can be a relationship ender easily, right? And I empathize with that because, if you have this rule, whether, it's spoken or not, that porn is bad, masturbation is bad. And that's the other thing too, like porn is the scapegoat here. And often I've worked with couples when I was doing clinical work, and porn was discovered and it was not allowed in the relationship. And so the person got caught, they got into therapy. And I was like, is this really about porn? I was like, so if they didn't watch porn and they just masturbated to fantasy, how would you feel about that? And the same feelings would come up, right? Like, this is a betrayal. I'm not good enough. There's some insecurity and jealousy that would come up with that. What are they thinking about, right? So that's another way that porn is used as a scapegoat, because we have like this browser history that's right in front of our face. It'd be like, oh, big titty goth girlfriends. I guess that's who you're into now, and I'm not that, right? But it's like, okay, put away the laptop, just have them masturbate to fantasy. What are they thinking about? Big titty goth girlfriends? I don't know, right? That's their fantasy life, but it could still bring up the same issues that porn does. So it's really less about the porn and more about the masturbation and the fact that they have a sex life outside of the relationship. Now, I get it that the insecurity stuff and the jealousy, that can be dealt with in any kind of relationship, secular or religious, where it's a problem, and oftentimes it has a difficult time recovering from, is from the betrayal, right? And so if there was an agreement of not masturbating, not watching pornography, and then you're caught doing it, you're doing that in secret. And a lot of times you have like a lot of lies that go into that secrecy of like, oh, what were you doing in there? Or, so it's building up a lot of lies in the relationship. And that's not going to be healthy for any relationship, regardless of what you're lying about, regardless of what you're keeping a secret. And so when that gets discovered, that's a betrayal. And a lot of relationships do not recover, understandably, from a type of betrayal.
Yeah.
But just on an individual level, this can create the feelings of guilt and shame and embarrassment, and feeling as if you're out of control, feeling as if you're a pervert or a deviant or however else they're labeling like this sexual obsession that they have. A lot of times they are very much concerned about what kind of material, whether it's pornography or in fantasy, is arousing to them. And they over pathologize themselves like, oh, I'm into watching bondage, and so that must be, I have a paraphilic disorder. I'm a pervert in some way. Why do I have this? And so it's a lot of self-condemnation, and that's just going to create a whole host of like anxiety and depressive symptoms for the person individually, even if they're not in a relationship. But important thing here has nothing to do with the content of the porn, nothing to do with the content of the fantasies. It's just how they have a belief system that doesn't line up with what they're doing. It doesn't allow for any kind of quote unquote deviant sexual fantasy.
Yeah. In your clinical work and research, have you seen impacts from people like on an individual level, not even in a relationship, but what are some of the long-term impacts that you've seen from having these beliefs and trying to like untangle from them and move on with their life?
Yeah, beyond the just like, the guilt and shame and the anxiety and the depressive symptoms that can come along with this, it really does follow kind of like an eating disorder kind of cycle. So I'm thinking like bulimia disorder, in which there's like a vow of like abstinence, right? So that would be like the vow of like stopping the binge eating or having some type of restrictive diet and things like that. But it's too restrictive. Right. And so they go through these periods of like over restricting and needs aren't being met, tension is rising, and then they break one day and like the language that's used within like masturbating to porn is like they're relapsing, right? So that's a common term that they use if they vow to not do this, to abstain from it. And then they do it, they call that like a relapse. So they're using very kind of, chemical dependency type of language. And so they have this quote unquote relapse, and then the guilt and the shame comes in, and then another vow of like heavily restrictions on their sexual expression and their desire and their thoughts and all that, and just goes through this kind of nasty cycle that doesn't really break for them until they can really see that maybe you're being too restrictive. Like, well, because when I always would approach this clinically, when I was doing clinical work, I would never approach it because the clients would come in wanting to ban porn from their life altogether. They were blaming porn as kind of like the focal point of all their problems. And yeah, on the surface, it got them into some problems individually, interpersonally, whatever. But I was always quick to kind of flip that a little bit by saying, how can you watch porn and masturbate to porn in a healthy manner? What would that look like for you, right? And so just to kind of play it off of like, I'm not here to kind of restrict things for you. That's not my role. You're a part of this belief system that may have put these restrictions on you, right? And we can explore whether or not those restrictions, fit how you want to live your life, because they may not. And that's the problem, is that if we just approach this as porn's the problem, then we'll just go along with, let's try to work on all these ways to like avoid porn and have like these porn blockers on your phone and accountability buddies and all of that. But it's like, well, maybe the beliefs are actually harmful, and maybe we should take a look at if this is a good fit, right? Where did these beliefs come from? Were they given to you by like family members? Were you born into them? Okay, we all are born into like a belief system, but are they still serving you now as an adult? Because you can like deviate from that. People do. So really not just viewing it as porn's the problem, but possibly the beliefs around porn are a problem, and which one needs to be altered more.
Yeah. So good.
No, I agree entirely. I'm sitting here like reflecting on folks I've worked with, but also my own personal experience of like when I was still in the church now many years ago, and like being 20 years old and being told very explicitly, that I was a sex addict by a pastor that I went to for pastoral counseling. Of course, secular counseling was of course frowned upon. Right.
Right. Because they would be saying things that I'm saying right now.
Exactly. Are you familiar with the book Every Man's Battle?
No.
No. It was a
big lad.
Well, you were spared, but it was.
It sounds like it just based on the language.
It's about overcoming sexual temptation and addiction and all of that. Of course, geared towards men within like an evangelical framework. So that was also the book that I was handed in that context. It's just making me think of a lot of these memories, and I guess that leads me to my next question. That was like I'm just what is your opinion on what is it? Why is it that religion has such an adverse like relationship to masturbation, or has such a restrictive view of just sexuality in general? Like why, like functionally, why the need for this high control?
I think that's it. It's high control. It's a very easy way to kind of keep people under their thumbs. And you even see this now in a secular way playing out in like various places within the manosphere, which, you know, I had to dabble in a little bit to write my book, because so much of the misinformation about masturbation is coming out of like people like Andrew Tate,
Oh
who
gosh.
think they have, you know, any kind of like self-described like wellness guru or, you know, masculine self-help kind of guy. And what they're doing, and it's the same playbook, right? So they're all grifters, and we can kind of look at high control religion or any religious belief as kind of like a grift in and of itself in a lot of different ways, because they have a certain investment to get something out of their congregation and to kind of keep them in line and to get that something out of it, an intended goal. And what better way than to try to control something that is so natural as human sexuality and human sexual desire, and to have you questioning whether or not something's wrong with you just for having certain feelings and urges and desires, which are perfectly natural and can be engaged in a perfectly healthy way. But now you're getting these messages that are saying like, no, this is the devil tempting you, right? These are actually bad. You need to rein this in, or you're a terrible person, right? Without actually saying that. Maybe some people have heard that directly, but saying it in the way of like, you're sinning, you're going to hell, you're letting down God, you're letting down your family, you're letting down your faith community, whatever the case may be. And, you know, what is so evilly brilliant about this, if I can give them any credit for being intelligent with this, is that it sets the person up for failure, because you're having them trying to control such an innate and natural part of them. It's like trying to restrict food intake. It's trying to restrict any other kind of natural drive that we have, and to experience pleasure in a very natural way. Is that, yeah, you put restrictions on that, very, very heavy restrictions on that, you're going to violate it, right? Even just violate it in thought, which is considered a sin in a lot of different people's eyes. And so when you do that, then you feel bad, and you need to atone, and you need to repent. And what's the remedy for all that? Is like to be more invested in the church, to lean heavily more so on your faith leaders, right? And so they get you in, they hook you in. And it's the same thing that's going on in like the manosphere now, because they're trying to sell you these self-improvement tactics of like, oh, get up at 4 a.m., take a cold plunge, you know, hit the gym for 2 hours, invest in crypto, you know, all this kind of bullshit. And it's not going to turn your, you know, your life around or anything. But they also say don't masturbate. And what's interesting with that is it's setting yourself up to failure, just how the church does. And when you do masturbate, you feel like shit. But what's the remedy for that? You need to work harder. That's just showing you that you aren't strong enough to do this. So buy my next coaching session on how to be a real man. So this is like, oh, you don't have strong enough faith, right? And so you need to pray more, devote yourself more to the church, because clearly you're still too easily tempted by some of these satanic, you know, sexual things that are in your life. So in that way, I think it's
Interesting.
brilliant. An easy way to control people is try to be overly restrictive in such a natural part of their life that they're setting themselves up for failure.
Yeah. I had no idea that that message was being promoted, like in a quote unquote secular culture, the don't
Hmm.
masturbate thing with like Andrew Tate
Right,
and
right.
that whole crew. I had no idea, but it's so dangerous.
Yeah.
Yeah. I want to, I think that high control religion, well, or religion, like really has this narrow definition for sexuality, like
Hmm.
human sexuality in general. I find it to be much more expansive than like whose genitals are bumping up against whose.
Right.
Um, how, if you were to kind of give a definition of sexuality, like for an individual, what would that be or include?
I think it just has to, you know, on an individual level, it is really just being open and honest with yourself of what turns you on. How frequently are you turned on, and turning really inward into yourself, because we
Hmm.
can't really separate our sexual selves from ourselves. I mean, it is who we
Yes.
are as people. Everything so much on a chromosomal level, hormonal level, neurotransmission, everything is wrapped up in our sexuality, whether it's a drive or other type of function or interest or orientation or identity. It's all in there. It's who we are as people. And so I think it's kind of, to me, trying to define sexuality as like this outside thing or something that we can just like come in and out of as we please is really kind of missing the point of what sexuality is. It is being human. Human sexuality is being human. It's similar to trying to have like a mind-body dichotomy, like a dualism, like the brain is separate from the rest of the body. It's like, no, it's all body, right? The brain is just another organ. It's like running the ship, but the ship is still part of all the body. So I view sexuality in that same way. It's like, it's just who we are, and we're all different. And so we all have a different body. We all have a different sexuality, therefore. And I think kind of going back to the original conversation we were having about Satanism is like recognizing authenticity, and the Satanic Bible that was even written in 1966 did a great job of like devoting a chapter to quote unquote satanic sex, which is just authentic sexual expression. Know what is right for you. To be sexually progressive or liberated doesn't mean you have to like attend orgies or like BDSM play parties or anything like that. It's just figuring out what kind of desire you have for yourself, who you are attracted to, how often you like to have sex, how you like to have sex, and living accordingly. And that may include going to orgies and BDSM play parties, but it may not. It's just do what's right for you. And that's not the message that religions like try to teach of like, hey, you do you, right? Live deliciously, however you're defining that. It's like, no, they have the definition for you, but the actual definition of sexuality just has to be developed by the individual, or what that looks like for them.
Yeah. I've shared this before in different platforms or whatever. My first experience, like sexual experience with somebody, I expected to feel immense guilt and shame for all the reasons we've talked about, but instead felt a deep sense of connection to myself, to the universe, to God, to whatever. And I couldn't articulate it at the time, but I can articulate it now. I was like, oh, I am powerful unto myself. Like I am an empowered being. I'm whole. And I know why the church puts all these rules around me, because as this authentic whole human, I don't need anybody or anything else to, you know, tell me what's good or bad or right or wrong or whatever. And I've always said that I think that the church controls your sexuality so that they can control you. Like if they control that very essence, that core piece of who you are, they're just controlling you.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
that's why they grab onto it so hard.
Yeah, and you're talking like a Satanist now.
Oh. Maybe I have something to explore.
Right, because that's at the heart of it, right? This individualism of like you are your own being, right? And the idea that going into a congregation, that they don't look at you as like an individual, right? They look at you. I mean, just think of some of the religious language that we have around group identity of like flock, and it's a shepherd, and all of that is like, no, you're just literally just a sheep amongst a herd that needs a shepherd to be guided in the right direction. There's no individuality, there's no individualism, and which I always thought was pretty interesting of like how strong Christianity is in this country, particularly with the evangelical community, and how much of a contrast it is from other American ideals of like individualism and freedom. It's like those two kind of conflict in my eyes, of like what it means to be an individual and like kind of rejecting kind of a group think, and I'm going to do it my way and all that. It's like, no, the religious groups do not want that at all. They want you all together and to kind of move you in mass, right? There's no room for individual expression, and i.e. individual authentic expression.
Yeah, so good.
I'm sitting over here thinking of like future episode ideas of like healing trauma with Satanism, because I say that laughingly but also seriously, because like functionally one of the biggest markers for trauma we found is like when you folks don't have autonomy, like when you're robbed of that ability to have agency and to do what you need to do to take care of yourself. Like that's one of the biggest ways that we can determine if trauma symptoms are going to be showing up down the road, and yeah, so it's like the high control religion versus what you're describing is that, like, this is what Satanism is all about. Like, well,
Right.
damn, actually, that's a hell of a lot more trauma informed than the church I grew up going to.
Right. Yeah. And I know we're kind of saying this in jest, and it sounds like I may be trying to recruit on behalf of like some satanic organization. I am not. That's actually very anti-satanic to try to recruit
I feel
people.
no pressure, no pressure.
People come to Satanism on their own terms, and that's part of what it actually means to be a Satanist. But what is actually
I love
interesting
that.
is that there has been, I'm not aware of any like empirical research that's been done to kind of look at this, but definitely anecdotally, people are attracted to some of the rituals within Satanism for that very reason. And so going back to like Anton LaVey, the founder of Satanism in the 60s, he developed like this black mass, which is essentially an inverse of the Catholic mass. And it's very sacrilegious. It's very blasphemous. On the altar, there's nudity involved, and there's orgasms, and there's desecration of the host, and all this thing that going on that would have your conservative religious aunt being like pearl clutching for sure. But the function of that, and they're not conjuring demons or anything because they don't believe in demons. The function of that is a psychodrama to shed any shame or guilt or any kind of hook that religion may still have on you. Because engaging in sacrilege or blaspheming completely from a secular perspective should not have any like really strong negative impact on you, because you're not really doing anything against something that you believe in because you don't believe in it, right? So, but it's kind of a form of exposure therapy to go through like intentionally, yeah, I don't believe in this anymore, but yeah, I'm still kind of like, I don't know if I can watch a horror movie because I've been told there's been demons in it or something like that. It's actually exposing you to the things that you no longer believe in and working through some of those intense emotions of like, no, I can shed this off, right? I can reclaim myself as an individual apart from this belief system that I grew up in, and I'm just doing it in a very blasphemous and sacrilegious way. So yeah, I know we're all saying this in jest, but there is function within Satanism in some of these kind of satanic rituals that do serve that function for some members.
I love that. Yeah. I mean, I think healing is so beautiful because it's so subjective to the person,
Mm-hmm.
and so there's like room for all of that in this process of individualized healing, which I think is so great.
Mm-hmm.
And if people can find like a spirituality to connect to, gosh, I mean, I just think that's wonderful.
Mm-hmm.
And it's totally dependent on them and their values, which is, yeah, just very different than high control religion.
Right, for sure.
Yeah, and you mentioned the word desire discrepancy, and maybe
Mm-hmm.
this question kind of goes along with it. But purity culture in particular really teaches that men are hypersexuals, out of control sexual animals. Women on the other side are, basically asexual. Of course, it's a very binary gender system,
Mm-hmm.
but is that something you've seen in your work in terms of that binary, but also like what the impacts are of it?
Yeah, what's interesting with that, especially the kind of labeling guys as always struggling with their, sex drive, something that always needs to be reined in. It's like, well, who's putting the restrictions on men's sexual desires, right? Why is it being labeled as out of control or inherently like addicting, that they're hypersexual? It's like, no, it's all relative. It's like, yeah, if you just expect somebody, regardless of gender, to only express their sexual desire in this one very narrow way, most people are going to be labeled hypersexual because they're going to have desires and drives that go beyond what is allowed. So I think that's one part where they get it very wrong of labeling all guys as hypersexual is because they've put the restrictions on guys not to be sexual, aiming with perfectly normal, within normal limits, sexual desires, both in terms of how often they want to have sex, the type of sex that they want to be having. There's nothing hyper about it from a clinical perspective, but from their eyes, it's hyper because it goes against, it's pushing beyond the limits of what is considered healthy sexual expression for men. So with that, and I'll talk about women here in a second, but with that kind of placed on guys, that any kind of desire that they're feeling is likely like an out of control kind of desire. You need to, rein this in. You see that pop up within this kind of the moral incongruent stuff like all the time because they aren't going to be able to rein it in, so to speak, 100% of the time. They are going to be engaging in various types of sexual behavior that go against their values and what they're told they should and should not be doing. And that's going to create a lot of, the distress and shame and embarrassment and labeling oneself as a sex addict and like, see, my pastor was right, I am a sex addict. So it's all kind of like this bizarre self-fulfilling prophecy. It's like, it doesn't have to be this way. All this pathology is coming out of this value system and these restrictions that are placed on you. Whereas if you had different values, you didn't have these restrictions, there wouldn't be any pathology. Now with women, what's interesting, and this is historical as well, of just ignoring women's sexuality, that, it shouldn't exist at all. And historically that has, I don't know, saved is not the best word because that sounds positive, but it at least has sheltered a lot of women from certain types of condemnation that guys have gotten about sex and what you should and should not be doing, just because it hasn't been on their radar. Like this would be like giving an interest for girls or women to engage in. So we don't need to spend the time of talking to them directly of like how to avoid temptations of like masturbation or like don't touch yourself. Like, boys will be boys, but like girls aren't going to be doing this. So we don't have to have a separate lecture for them. Right. So they've been spared, I guess, from some direct messaging. And that goes back thousands of years, even within the Jewish Talmud. It's focused on controlling guys' arousal, makes no mention of women other than saying directly like, women don't get aroused from this type of touching. So it's like, okay, they could. But again, it kind of spared them direct condemnation just out of ignorance of thinking that girls and women do not have any kind of sex drive that would even be remotely close to what we're concerned about with men and boys. And where that, and I say like it spares them some messaging, but it's still a message in and of itself and creates its own problems, because now if a girl or a woman does have any kind of sex drive and interest, there could be a self-pathologizing to that. It'd be like, wait, I'm not supposed to feel this way. The boys are supposed to feel this way. Why am I struggling, reining in my sexual thoughts and urges and desires to masturbate or to look at porn? Like, what's wrong with me, right? And even just doing that like once a week, once a month can be viewed as out of control and abnormal and too much of a sexual sin, that there's something very wrong with me because I'm having any kind of sexual thoughts. And I'm a girl, I'm a woman, I shouldn't be having any thoughts like this at all.
Yeah. That's a lot. There's a million more things I could say to that, but maybe that's a different conversation for a different day.
Yeah, there's so much within just the framework of purity culture. Because like, I mean, the one thing you said about like women's sexuality, it just half the time isn't acknowledged, or at least in the framework of like the evangelical brand of purity culture that I grew up in. It's like, or if it is acknowledged, it's in the framework of like it's there to serve men in the context of a monogamous, godly marriage, and that's the only way. That's the only place that it can exist and be okay.
Yeah.
It's
again where that's the interesting thing too, because sex and sexual expression is permissible within these religions, but it has to play by a very narrow rule book, right? And it has to be expressed in a particular way toward a particular person. And so anything that deviates from that, which is like 99.9% of sexual behaviors that we could engage in, could deviate from that, right? Especially going back to like women's sexuality of like the role of having a vibrator, right? That in no way can fit in to a lot of these rigid definitions of what healthy sexual expression should look like, because that's going to focus way too much on their own pleasure and not on like mutual pleasure. Even if they are engaged in like using sex toys together, a lot of times I've heard like that's still a distraction, right? That's bringing in outside aids that shouldn't be there, right? It's taking away from the love and the connection. It's like, it's bullshit, right? It's like, find whatever gets you off in the most efficient way possible. And a lot of times that is a sex toy, and particularly vibrators. And if that works for you, great. Why put a restriction on that, right? My secular brain from when I was 16, I don't understand all this. Like I can intellectualize and kind of start seeing where they get it from, but then I have to step back and be like, why are you doing this to yourself, right? Or why are you putting these restrictions on yourself? This is human created, right? And this is where I start viewing it. And if I would, I don't do clinical work now, but if I did, in the back of my mind, I would be like, okay, this is what you want. You want to adhere to these rules. Just know, like, this is your cross to bear. So, of course, you're going to have struggles with your sex drive and your sexuality in general. But this is what you're signing up for. It doesn't have to be this way, but this is actually what you're signing up for. And it is going to be a life of feeling as if you're a big old pervert. And you know what? Maybe you are, and that's great, right? There's a lot of other value systems that would say, yeah, you're a pervert. Awesome. Good for you. Go be a perv. You're perfectly fine.
Oh, yeah, that's good. Well, I know you recently wrote a book, and so I'm curious if you can just share a little bit about it and why it might be important, especially for those of us healing from purity culture.
Sure. So I wrote a book on the history and science of masturbation called DIY. And it stemmed from, it kind of stemmed very organically. I wasn't planning on writing a book on this topic, but I was seeing so many comments on Instagram that just were spouting a lot of pseudoscientific nonsense about the effects of masturbation, and more from like a medical perspective, right? I always would get like, some religious fanatics in my mentions or whatever saying I'm going to hell. And I was like, okay, whatever. I know that. But for the people that were just saying like, oh no, masturbation, you shouldn't tell people to do that because it lowers your testosterone, it makes you weak, it makes you depressed, socially anxious. I'm like, where is this coming from? And so that really kind of started my interest of like looking into a lot of these beliefs that I thought like we stopped believing in like hairy palms and going blind for masturbation when we were kids. But no, there's a whole world out there of people who are believing that masturbation is very, very harmful to your body. Physically, psychologically, relationally, and all that. So that served as the origin story, so to speak, of writing this book. And it just, it's a humorous deep dive into all these kind of claims and where they came from, and currently where they're coming from. It's really no different where they were coming from hundreds of years ago. It's the same messaging. And I didn't write it as a self-help book, even though Barnes & Noble keeps it in their self-improvement section, which kind of annoys me, but because I didn't write it as a self-help book. But feedback that I have gotten from people is that it has been helpful for them to counter messages, anti-sex messages, anti-masturbation, anti-porn messages specifically that they've gotten throughout their life. And this is just coming through, just challenging all the bullshit that they've heard. And just kind of setting the record straight of like, yeah, masturbation, there's nothing inherently unhealthy about it. And I go into how it can be unhealthy, and that's kind of what we've been talking about this whole time, but it's ironically unhealthy if you think it's unhealthy for you. But if you don't think it's unhealthy, it's likely not going to have any negative consequences in your life. So enjoy yourself. And so in that way, I've heard it's been more of like a quote unquote self-help book for people that need to hear that message and need to hear it coming from somebody who has, a research background and a clinical background in this area and just can cut through all the bullshit and just, cite the research that says, no, you know what? Live your life. Live deliciously. This isn't going to hurt you in any way.
I love that.
Yeah. I appreciate that. I appreciate your background too, and that you do have a little bit different background than a lot of the folks I work with, in that you didn't grow up in like evangelicalism version of purity culture. And yeah, like you said, just kind of being able to cut through some of the bullshit. Like, I don't know. I've really found that there's a lot of value in that, at having professionals in the field who are helping folks recovering from purity culture, but maybe didn't directly grow up in it themselves. I think sometimes those of us who grew up in it, even though, we've done a lot of the work and have done a lot of the trainings and all the things, like, I don't know, there's still just a unique perspective that you have that I'm seeing more and more. Like, it really is very helpful for folks. I know another person in the community, she's a sex educator, Erica Smith. I know she does not directly have a background in having grown up grown up within it like a lot of us did. And I've heard the same thing as well. Like, folks really resonate with a lot of what she's presenting. And she does have, like you, a background where didn't grow up in it in the same way. But
I think everyone's for sure, and I think everybody has like a voice in this fight. I don't have like the experiential or anecdotal kind of voice where I'm talking about my own experience growing up in it, beyond just kind of being a bored altar boy, just looking forward to my family going to Dunkin' Donuts. That was our weekly ritual. That was the Catholic ritual I liked the best. Like after Mass, then we went to Dunkin' Donuts, and that was memorable. I have a lot of memories of Dunkin' Donuts, more so than being inside the church an hour beforehand. But yeah, I think, those perspectives are definitely needed. The more memoir kind of stuff. And I know there are writers out there who have published books in that area. I am not one. I can talk more about it from more of an objective, non-subjective, outside perspective of just, here's the research in this area, and this may or may not be helpful to you, but just coming from an outside source, I think you're going to be all right with this.
I love that. I love that.
Yeah, I think we ask all of our guests this. We try to anyway. Is there anything that you wish that we had asked you, or anything else that you would simply like our listeners to hear?
Well, you didn't ask what my favorite horror movie was, and I'm disappointed by that.
We didn't. That was before recording when I brought up all the
Right, yeah,
horror
we talked
stuff.
about horror movies a little bit before we started on here.
I would love to know.
Yeah, and it is relevant. I'll make it relevant here. That would be The Witch. It's odd that a routinely favorite movie of mine was made so recently. I think it first premiered in 2015 and then got released in the theaters 2016. I saw it in the theaters, I've seen it at least once, possibly twice every year since, and it just keeps getting better for me. It's a perfect horror movie. And why I think it's so good is relevant to what we've been talking about today of like living authentically. And realizing that some religious messaging is too restrictive. If for some people it fits them, right? And if you want to live within this very highly controlled, highly restrictive kind of environment, it's like, okay, I'm not one to kind of like try to, white savior you out of it. But I think for a lot of people, it's too restrictive, and it's very inauthentic to try to live that way. And to find your true sense of self, including what your true sense of sexuality is, and to kind of break free from that early messaging and realize that you can carve your own path, and it's going to be scary and everything, but it's also going to be extremely liberating. And that's the main theme of The Witch, beyond the folklore of early New England witch tales and beliefs of like the devils lurking in the woods and possessing these farmers. That's all the fun horror stuff. But the theme is what we've been talking about: is living authentically, living deliciously, knowing yourself, and pursuing that.
Way to bring it home, like all good pastors.
I can always wrap up horror movies into the main theme of what we've been talking about.
I love that. I will go check that out actually, because I've seen that. I know the movie you're talking about. I don't think I've ever seen that one.
Yeah, it's a good one. It's a slow burn. It's not like the jump scare kind of horror movie, but it's atmospheric. It's moody, great acting.
Yeah.
And
nice.
The Witch.
I love it. Well, if people want to follow your work, get your book, where can they find all of that? Especially if they want to get good horror movie recommendations.
Yeah.
I'm sure you post about it.
I do post
where
about
where
it.
can you be found?
Yeah, so I'm mainly active on Instagram, and my handle is @DrSprankle. Same handle for Twitter. And drsprankle.com. I have some links up there where you can find the book. It's DIY, The Wonderfully Weird History and Science of Masturbation. The links that I have on my website, there's two of them that are local retailers here in Minnesota, where there's signed copies that they can send to you, they can mail to you. Otherwise, it's just like Amazon, Barnes & Noble, wherever you find books. It's available.
Awesome. Well, I will make sure to put all of that in the show notes so that people can grab that. But I do encourage people to follow along, get your book, DIY it,
Yeah,
figure this
absolutely.
out.
I appreciate that.
I love it. Well, thank you again, Dr. Eric Sprankle, for being here. It's been such a wonderful conversation.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Thank you again to Dr. Eric Sprankle for joining us today. That was a really great conversation that we got to have with him. I'm really grateful that he came on the podcast.
Yeah, I thought it was so good. It's always so interesting to have a perspective from somebody who's like in the field that this work is in, but didn't grow up in it. And they're able to just bring such a different perspective and, things that we don't often think about. But they can kind of see it from that different angle. And it's a lot of food for thought.
Yeah. Yeah, well, just I mean, just being able to so matter of factly present like the evidence or like this is what the research
Yeah.
says, and
Yeah.
here you go. And it's like because
Yeah.
even for I'll just speak anecdotally for myself. It's like I know a lot of that too, but it still kind of hits different when you come from it, and it's like
Yeah.
um yeah, I don't know. It's so I do
Yeah.
really appreciate the perspective of some of these folks
Yeah.
who are working professionally in the field but don't have that background. Like
Hmm.
you say.
Yeah. And I thought, just his emphasis several times on like it's not necessarily the thing that you're doing that is quote unquote good or bad. It's actually relatively neutral. So whether that's looking at pornography or masturbating, it's the messages behind it. It's the things that you're told about it that bring about the guilt and the shame and the impact that we see it. And yeah, I mean, I know we've said this before, but it's like if you are told you can't have chocolate cake, the only thing you want is chocolate cake. And then when you have it, you're going to feel guilty. But if you're told you can have it or not, it literally does not matter, then you all of a sudden have this choice and you can have it and feel fine and not have it, feel fine. Like it's a totally different thing. And that seems so common with other things. But
Yeah.
then when it comes to things like masturbation and pornography, we put all these moral values on it, when in reality, it is just such a natural part of who we are in terms of coming in contact with our own sexuality. And religion does such a disservice to people
Yeah.
by putting all these rigid rules and parameters around it.
It really does. It really does. It's funny. Um, well, yeah, I'll share this. It's just, again, from my own experience, but it's, because I mentioned on the episode how like I had, when I was like 20 or 21, I was young. I was very young. Had a pastor tell me that I was a sex addict. And it's funny because what a pastor in 2 years' time couldn't help quote fix. I had a therapist, in early grad school, and he quote fixed what the pastor pretty much in one session within 5 minutes with this other guy couldn't do in 2 years. And so because we were talking about that, like this, like,
Wow.
sexual addiction
Wow.
type stuff. And he was like, why do you think it's this? Like, he's like, that's an interesting,
Yeah.
that's a heavy term. Like, why are you saying it like that? And he's like,
Yeah.
and then he just simply asked you, is it causing you distress? And I'm like, no, other than the fact that I think I'm not supposed to be doing it. He's like, are you harming anybody? I'm like, well, no. And he's like, okay, then what the fuck's the problem? That was those were his
Yeah.
exact words. He's like, what's the fuck? Like, the problem is, he's like, the fact that you think you're not supposed to, and the shame is like spiraling you. He's like, the thing itself isn't even a problem. It doesn't sound like. And funny, it really was almost like a night and day. Like suddenly it was like this burden just rolled off my shoulders, and suddenly, like you say, chocolate cake. Now it's like, that's all you can think about. And you feel like you're this deviant, hyper fixating on something, but suddenly like you can eat as much as you want. No one cares. Suddenly it's like, I could take it or leave it. No one cares.
Yeah.
Nobody cares.
Literally nobody cares. Yeah.
Yet in the church,
Yeah.
oh, they cared.
Mhm.
So
Mhm. But I really do think it's a control thing of going like, if we can control this core part of who you are, your very humanity, then we can control you because we can shame you for being a human. And then we've got the solution, it's such a control mechanism, which is just, I hate that. Yeah.
yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. And then
And
that's absolutely.
I've had so many clients who, like, regardless of what gender they grew up as, like, really believe that they were a sex addict because they masturbated on a daily basis or on a weekly basis. And they're like, there must be, and it's like, even after leaving purity culture, I know we talk about this all the time because of the way fundamentalism is often embodied, but have had to do a lot of work with clients, even post religion, of getting that to a neutral space and say like, yeah, is it really that you're feeling guilt and shame for what you've done? Or is it because the messages that you've been indoctrinated into you have told you to feel guilt and shame for what you've done? And every time it's that. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Definitely.
Yeah. Well, another great conversation. I'm so glad that Dr. Sprankle was able to join us, and I'm really hopeful that people really got a lot out of it.
Yeah, I hope so. I was really glad that we were able to get him on and also talk briefly about horror movies too. I know that's not everybody's cup of tea,
Yes.
but yeah, it was a lot of
I
fun.
love it. I love it. I love it. Well, I think that is it then for our episode today. And with that, all God's people said, Amen.
Amen.